back to Squawk Box. Our next guest introduced bipartisan legislation yesterday designed to protect consumers by pushing to require ticket sellers to disclose their fees up front. I want to bring in Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. Senator, I want to thank you for joining us. This is a bipartisan bill. I don't know, is there anybody who disagrees with this? I would think that the truth and showing the numbers up front makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think there's bipartisan agreement. This is legislation, the Ticket Act, that I introduced this week with Maria Cantwell, Democrat from Washington State. Maria is the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee. I'm the ranking member, the senior Republican on the Senate Commerce Committee. So we've introduced this together, and I'm confident we're going to get it passed. And it addresses a problem that affects a lot of consumers, which is when you go to buy tickets, whether to a sporting event, when you're going to see baseball or football or basketball, or you're going to a concert. You know, just recently, my 12-year-old daughter, Catherine, went to see Taylor Swift in concert, and she had an amazing time. She said, "Dad, it was the most incredible experience of my entire life." That was awesome. But when you go buy the tickets, at the back end, you get a ton of fees added on. The data show that the average fees added on to a ticket range anywhere from 21% all the way up to 58%. And so what the Ticket Act does is it requires those fees to be disclosed up front. Right when you start, you know the total price of the ticket, so you don't get surprised after you've gone through the whole process and get hit on the back end.
Okay, so
what
Senator,
it also does is...
Go ahead.
Yeah. What it also does is it addresses a practice called speculative tickets. So a number of these sites will sell you a ticket, and you think you bought a ticket to go see the Yankees. And it turns out you didn't. The person selling it doesn't have a ticket to go see the Yankees. They're basically selling you an option, and once you buy it, they go try to find a ticket for you, but it's not going to be the ticket they actually sold you. And so the Ticket Act requires, if it's a speculative ticket, they disclose that up front, too, that the consumer deserves to know. If you don't have the thing they say they're selling it to you, then don't advertise and pretend that you do.
Okay, so here's the larger question, I think, is to the extent that you support this move around ticketing, would you extend this out to all kinds of practices around advertising for any product at any price point? And I say, you talk about a cell phone, for example, you'll see sometimes say $99 a month or whatever it is. You actually get the bill, it's like $140 or $150 a month. You could do this for airline tickets. I mean, you could go down the list of things that are misadvertised to the public, and they realize only at the last second what the actual price is.
Look, I think there's potential value to that approach. It needs to be in an industry where there's been a problem. You know, I spent a couple of years as the head of policy at the Federal Trade Commission, and the Federal Trade Commission statutorily is focused on consumer protection. And one of the key aspects of consumer protection is disclosure, is not allowing advertisers, not allowing retailers to engage in fraud or deception. And so I think it is a much better practice to advertise the price up front so that consumers know what they're getting. And when consumers have information, they can exercise informed choice and get the products and goods and services they want.
Senator, while we have you, another sort of business policy dispute, if you will, that's taking place on a very large stage. It's a state issue at this point, but it's going to federal court, which is Disney now suing the governor and the state of Florida over his decisions around what they've described as retribution around tax policies and the like. What do you think of both First Amendment for corporations on one end and the ability of political leaders, elected leaders on the other end, potentially to pursue that retribution, which DeSantis has, by the way, said pretty explicitly is why he has done this?
So, look, I haven't examined the particulars of this lawsuit that Disney has filed. I will tell you, I think Ron DeSantis has done a terrific job as governor of Florida. And in the dispute with Disney, look, this started when Disney behaved, as a whole lot of corporations have, by engaging in essentially woke politics. That their employees demanded that Disney start attacking the legislature in Florida for passing legislation that prohibited teachers that are teaching kindergarten through third grade from getting into sexuality explicitly.
Ted, the opposite could happen, where you could have a corporation that engages in some anti-woke stuff that you would love, And if the Democrats went after them and said we're going to have retribution for doing that, I mean, this isn't good from either side, is it?
Well, I will say this also. What Florida did, if Florida were going out of their way to be simply punitive and target a company, I might well agree with you. But Disney had a very special carve-out, had a subsidy of a special tax district no one else got.
Which was fine until this.
And when you've got a practice of corporate welfare, I think it's perfectly fine to say, to go after that anyway, but especially when a company is getting into politics. I think way too many companies are getting into politics, and I'd rather Disney deal with Mickey Mouse and not be lobbying the legislature. And I think a lot of consumers are tired of companies that want a virtue signal rather than actually make a profit.
Wasn't the entire purpose of Citizens United the idea to give voice to corporations to actually be able to influence politics? This is something, by the way, Democrats never wanted, actually.
Well, look, there's no doubt Disney has a right to do this, but if they have a right to do this, they also face the consequences of their actions. And let's be clear, Citizens United was primarily dealing with corporations like the Sierra Club, like Planned Parenthood, like the NRA. With corporations, there are lots of nonprofit corporations that express views all the time, and they exist to do that. If Disney wants to be a lobbying company, fine. But there are a whole lot of customers that like taking their kids to Disney movies that don't necessarily want to support their politics of their pressing Florida to start teaching about sex to 5-year-olds. I think 5-year-olds ought to be learning about reading and writing and arithmetic and not having a political or sexual agenda forced on them in the schools. And that's what the Florida legislature thought as well.
On CNBC, let's get to the debt ceiling, because that's more of what we worry about here. You can imagine what would happen, which is getting a little bit scary. I just want to, Speaker McCarthy had a big win yesterday. But the question is whether there really is any leverage over President Biden. And I want you to see a Dan Henninger piece today. And I may mention this to Speaker McCarthy. It's called The Perfect Democratic President, basically just saying President Biden won't negotiate, doesn't do press conferences, does only canned events, can't maintain focus, has minimal factual grasp. So naturally, with all that going for him, he's running for a second term with the total support of the Democratic Party. Mr. Biden likely wouldn't be able to do this if it was anyone other than Donald Trump. And my point is, Senator, it's very dangerous if we get to a point where the president feels like he can insist on this clean debt ceiling and neither side comes to an agreement and we default, which people think is and it won't stick to Joe Biden because he is the perfect president for progressives. They can do whatever they want, and he won't. Nothing tarnishes him as long as Trump is going to be the nominee. Do you agree with that?
So, Joe, let me start by saying I agree with you that defaulting would be a terrible outcome.
Everyone says that.
And I believe the United States should never default. But the interesting thing is, Joe, there's one person on planet Earth who can actually guarantee we not default, and his name is Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.
You can see why he won't do it, though.
And the president could stand up and say the following. He could stand up and say the United States will never, ever, ever default on our debt. We will pay our debts. Now, if they did that every month, the federal government takes in more in tax revenue than interest on the debt. So Biden could do that tomorrow. The reason he doesn't want to do that is he wants to scaremonger. He wants to threaten a default. He wants to freak out the equity markets, the bond markets, and this is deliberate scaremongering. What I will tell you, what's dangerous? $32 trillion in debt is dangerous. What's dangerous is politicians that are bankrupting this country. As interest rates are rising, the cost of serving the debt is going up and up and up, and Biden and the Democrats don't want to change course at all. And historically, the debt ceiling has proven the most effective lever to force real and meaningful fiscal reforms. And I'll point back to 2010, the Budget Control Act. Then Republicans stood on the debt ceiling, said, we're going to use this leverage. Obama was president, and Obama blinked. And the person who negotiated the Budget Control Act was Joe Biden, who negotiated it with Mitch McConnell. What Biden is saying now is wildly irresponsible. I won't negotiate. I won't talk to anyone. To hell with you. Default on the debt. That is wrong, and it is indefensible, and I don't think he's going to be able to hold that line because Kevin McCarthy in the House cannot give in to him on a clean debt ceiling. And so Biden is going to blink, or else he's going to drive this country off a cliff.
Senator, you would have thought that the first 2 years that the 2022 election, that there would have been a lot of retribution. You looked at the polls, you looked at everything else, didn't happen.
Yeah.
It was a red whimper because of all these other, and the same thing can happen now. I don't think he's going to get blamed for this. So why should he do anything?
Although I'll tell you, Joe, I think one of the reasons, and I spent a lot of time out campaigning in 2022 for House candidates, for Senate candidates. Republicans did take the House. That was very significant. We wouldn't be having this debate if we hadn't taken the House.
They should have taken 70
I do think
seats.
we would have seen. I do think we would have seen a much bigger Republican victory.
Right.
If we had
Senator.
seen Republicans in Congress actually standing and fighting. And I'll tell you, we had a leadership battle in the Senate where I turned to our leadership and I asked the question, on what are you willing to fight? Is there anything? Because I can tell you our voters are frustrated saying, you know, what difference does it make? Now, I think it does make a difference, but I think it's incumbent on Republicans to demonstrate that we're willing to stand and fight, not on everything, but on something. And going from the national debt just 22 years ago, in the year 2000, the national debt was $5 trillion. Now it's $32 trillion. And what we're doing to the next generation is irresponsible. And I'm proud of House Republicans for standing up and having the courage to deliver on what they promised the voters. Now Joe Biden needs to do his job and not threaten the American economy, which is what he's doing right now.
I think we got a downgrade back when that instance you're talking about. For the first time ever, the U.S. debt got a downgrade. So we don't need any of this, Senator. And you know, you guys, Democrats and Republicans, are in charge while we're just sitting here like held hostage by this crazy stuff, and it's not good. Anyway, Senator, thanks. We're going to talk to Speaker McCarthy, see if he's got some answers. Thanks.